Professor Wren said, my name is Paige McLaughlin. Hello. And my sponsor is Dr. Kay Sanders, who I would love to thank right here just for all of her guidance throughout this project. This project literally would not exist without her. So thank you very much. And my project is titled SADolescence, which is social anxiety disorder during adolescence. Let's begin. So I want to start by asking you to think about a couple questions. First, I want you to just think about like what words you associate with puberty. Now, some people may think about things like awkward or rough times, and others may think more on like the technical side with words like development or adolescence or something of that nature. Also, what do you think of when you hear the term social anxiety? Again, some people may think more with like societal associations. So something like introverted or shy or antisocial even. And others may think more on the technical side with simply being anxious in social settings. So I just wanted to pose these questions just to get you thinking about puberty and social anxiety and like how these two may relate. So now on to my project. I did a literature review in which I collected and analyzed over 20 research articles in order to find out more about this relationship between puberty and social anxiety. And I did this for a couple different reasons. The second reason is kind of affected by the first one. So that is that I experienced social anxiety myself, and it seemed to have some sort of relation to puberty. And I've had conversations with friends and peers that have led me to believe that there was something there. So I've just kind of always been curious about that. So my curiosity and my love for working with young people have really led me to be more observant of young people, which, by the way, I define as like mid-20s and below for the sake of like development reasons. And so with all of this, like I've noticed that there seems to be a rise in anxiety, specifically social anxiety within younger populations. And this could be for many reasons, like the rise in social media or even the recent year with kids being online for school and not having like those physical social interactions. That being said, I won't be getting into those things, although they are equally interesting and important. For the sake of my project, though, finding out more about this general relationship between puberty and social anxiety is extremely important because, it can help to lead more knowledge on how to help adolescents with social anxiety, which ultimately will help them in the long run. Because serious psychological disorders like anxiety or depression, for example, could have lifetime lasting effects if not treated during this time. So before I go any further, I just want to quickly define puberty and social anxiety. I'm sure we all are aware of what puberty is, but just so that we're all on the same page, puberty is a crucial time in a person's life in which there is an immense amount of biological, social, and cognitive changes. As for social anxiety, I try to understand that not everyone has it, and not everyone is in the psych or development world. So this may be a little more necessary to define. So social anxiety, some people might have already heard it a little bit because it's used to be kind of interchangeable with the term social phobia. There's now more of a distinction between those two. So social anxiety disorder is often used with the acronym SAD, hence the title of my project. And it can be defined as the fear of negative evaluation, either because of the person's behavior, anxiety symptoms, appearance, or personality. All right, now that hopefully everyone is on the same page with what these two things are, we can move on to my actual research. So I wanted to not only look at the relationship between puberty and social anxiety, but also a few different factors that may relate to it. The first being timing, which is basically when an individual develops either earlier, at the same time, or later than their peers. The second major factor is gender and how developmental differences among boys and girls may impact this relationship between puberty and social anxiety. And I also wanted to see how racial and ethnic differences may affect either puberty or social anxiety or the relationship between the two. And lastly, I looked at how peer relations may play a part in this connection. So with all of that said, I examined the idea that puberty is a sensitive time for the development of social anxiety because of its timing for an individual, as well as the gender, race, ethnicity, and peer relations of an adolescent. So I have a few different main findings, and there's like a few different things within each of these factors. So they kind of overlap a little bit. Some of them are a little inconsistent, as you'll see. But first, I'll start with timing. So pubertal timing is defined as a stage when youth begin and complete specific physical milestones. So as mentioned previously, an individual can be considered early on time or late maturing compared to their peers. The main finding with this is that early maturing girls tend to have higher levels of social anxiety in comparison with on-time maturing girls, as well as early maturing boys. So basically, this means that adolescent girls who start or go through puberty before their peers are more susceptible to developing social anxiety. And this relates a bit to the next factor. So with gender, there are a couple things that I found. First, as we see with timing, girls seem to be, more vulnerable to social anxiety with its relation to puberty. And honestly, a lot of the research focuses on adolescent girls. Like even the articles that I was finding, some of them had only female participants. And I don't think I can say the same for male participants. Although I'm sure there are studies out there where they only focus on boys. But this is just simply to say that the majority of the research is focused on girls. So I was curious to see why this was. So I found a possible explanation, and that is simply just developmental differences. So basically, girls typically develop earlier than boys. It's about 1 to 2 years earlier. And because of this, there's a greater potential for negative social interactions, as well as psychological maladjustment among girls. Kind of a big word, but it's pretty self-explanatory. It just means like bad things, not so great things going on psychologically. So in addition to this, boys typically have a better experience regarding people's general reactions to their pubertal changes. So they might be less vulnerable to these rather negative effects of early pubertal timing. So this might be why the research tends to focus more on girls. That being said, I did see one study with African American adolescents in which they found that boys who were considered early maturing were more vulnerable to social anxiety symptoms rather than the girls. That being said, there is simply just not enough research on that, or just on boys in general with this topic to come to any kind of like conclusion, which kind of leads me into my next factor of race and ethnicity. So as I mentioned, there are some inconsistencies with this research regarding the differences among races and ethnicities. And part of that may be due to the fact that the majority of this research is predominantly on Caucasian samples. So kind of hard to find differences if they don't have differences within their samples. So when we have a study that has a more racially and ethnically diverse sample, there may be some contrasting findings, just simply because they weren't there previously. Also, because most of this research is on white adolescents, it's difficult to really know if the contrasting findings from these diverse samples are simply just like 1 or 2 studies that have inconsistent findings, or if there really is a trend within various populations. All that said, there are a few findings of differences between races and ethnicities. So regarding pubertal timing, African American girls tend to go through puberty earlier than their peers, and they tend to face more discrimination because of that, and that often leads to increases in social anxiety levels. And then just with social anxiety, it seems that Asian American adolescents in general tend to report higher levels of the disorder, which again may also be related to discrimination, but as well as like cultural factors regarding their education, considering that they often report more anxiety with academics, so like test anxiety, for example. With all of this said, though, there's just, again, simply not enough research examining the differences among various races and ethnicities. So it's difficult to pinpoint major trends. And a big part of this is research bias. So because of differences in culture, privilege, and possible varying times of pubertal development, as I've mentioned, these limited and often biased samples within the research make it harder for these findings to be generalized to the greater population. And even when researchers have quote unquote diverse samples um, to compare these differences, there often is still so much bias. For example, I found an article in which, like, even the title of the article, they were comparing Caucasian adolescents to African American adolescents. And there were over 300 Caucasian participants and less than 50 African American participants. So it would just be highly improbable to find any significant findings on that. So researchers really need to include more diverse samples that are nearly equal in size, especially when examining adolescents' physical and psychological health, because it's just a very important time in our lives, and we need that to be nice and safe. So moving on to our last factor, with peer relations, I found that social anxiety affects adolescents' relationships with their peers and vice versa. So first, social anxiety during adolescence often leads to individuals having poor social skills and being less liked by their peers, which only increases their social anxiety as they tend to fear social situations more. So it kind of becomes this just negative cycle of social anxiety affecting peer relations, and the effects of that lead to more social anxiety. And the pattern just continues if it's left untreated. And there also seems to be a link to risk-taking behaviors, which, as I'm sure some of us know, it is increases during this period. And part of this is like complying with peers. So adolescents are more likely to comply with their peers, so like do or say basically whatever they do or say. And they do this especially if they have had negative experiences with their relationships with adults in their lives, so with their teachers or their parents. They kind of turn to their peers and just kind of comply with them if they don't have that support elsewhere. So this compliance can lead to risk-taking behaviors, but also these adolescents who constantly like live in this cycle of complying with their peers, they'll eventually become less liked by their peers, which, as I've stated earlier, it ultimately leads to higher levels of social anxiety, especially if these adolescents don't have a greater support system elsewhere within their lives. So what does this all mean? Means a few different things, but I kind of broke it down into two points. So the first is that some adolescents seem to be more vulnerable to developing social anxiety, as we saw with the factors of timing and gender. Specifically, it's clear that adolescent girls who are considered early maturing compared to their peers are way more vulnerable to experiencing social anxiety symptoms. Also, as I've said before, we can understand that more research needs to be done, especially regarding the possible differences among races and ethnicities, seeing as this research just isn't there yet with trying to be consistent. So yeah, there's just, I mean, I can't stress that enough, that more research needs to be done. I think that could be said for many things, but especially with this. So what is the solution exactly? I mean, I think there are a few possible solutions. I don't know that you can really say that there's one solution for this entirety, kind of a big problem, I guess. So first and foremost, it's important to just recognize symptoms. So for parents, teachers, or anyone who works with young people, and I think even for peers, to be able to recognize symptoms of social anxiety. That's not to say that everyone should be diagnosing each other, because it's not very great to do. But I do think it is important for people to be aware of possible symptoms so that adolescents can receive help. Also, simply providing safe spaces for adolescents, especially in regards to their relationships with adults. I think that's also very important. As I mentioned previously, these adolescents can turn to risky behaviors and simply complying with their peers if they don't feel like they have that support either at home or with their teachers or any other adults in their lives. So it would be extremely helpful for them to know that they have the support in all areas of their lives. Lastly, and I think possibly the most important, is prevention and intervention. Obviously, prevention is the ideal because it would help to make sure that adolescents aren't experiencing social anxiety, or at least aren't experiencing it to an extreme extent. But that being said, if they do experience social anxiety, because these things are kind of inevitable in our world, I think, intervention is extremely beneficial, especially for adolescents who are already experiencing these symptoms. So something like therapy, for example, would be an obvious tool. And also things like practicing mindfulness or meditating, excuse me, could also be very useful for these adolescents struggling with social anxiety. Again, that's just kind of on an individual basis because some things work for some people and other things don't work for others. Um, Ultimately, it's crucial for adolescents to receive the necessary help, whatever that may be for that individual, so that they're less likely to have those lifelong symptoms of the disorder. So thank you all very much for listening to me. And thank you again to my sponsor, Dr. Kay Sanders, and also to Professor Wren for just both of your guidance throughout all 4 years of being at Whittier. Thank you.